The past decades, years, and even weeks have been devastating as a Western supporter of Hong Kong. As you've seen, their autonomy, their rights, and their protections stripped away by a Chinese Communist Party whose central mission is to snuff out democracy and the independent identity of the people of Hong Kong. And it has really reached a boiling point in the last few weeks as the Chinese Communist Party has thrown in prison many of the opposition leaders, and the LegCo, the last bastion of Chinese democracy, has essentially been rendered as a puppet organization of the Chinese Communist Party. This is not to say that Hong Kong is lost, but Hong Kong faces an incredibly difficult uphill battle to preserve the lost freedoms that it has or to push back the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. The only decision that the West has today is to extend the current sanctions that operate on China to Hong Kong to recognize that the distinction between those two bodies has functionally been erased. What am I going to prove in this debate? Firstly, I'm going to explain to you the unique relationship between the West and Hong Kong, and why we think the West has interests both in Hong Kong's freedom and independence and in pushing back Chinese influence in the world and region as a whole. Then I'll explain to you three things about these sanctions. I'll firstly explain to you why they are sustainable in the long term, why this is a fight that we can prolong for many years, and then I'll secondly explain how it influences Chinese Communist Party's behavior in a way that maximizes the two interests of the West that I outlined. So what are those two interests of the West? Firstly, we care about Hong Kong, both on a normative level, because we care about democracy. We've demonstrated time and time again that threats to democracy are threats to the very Western way of life. But moreover, the West has a self-interest in the preservation of a bastion of the rule of law in Asia, both in terms of the ripple effect it has on signaling to countries in Asia and in fact across the world that there are enormous value to be had in preserving the rule of law for your people, and in the access that the world and the West will have to the market of China in a system that is designed to curtail the influence of the CCP, does not allow them to bully companies, does not allow them to exert their influence over their population. But secondly, we care about curtailing China's influence because China's machinations do not stop at Hong Kong. They have designs on the world as a whole. And if you look at their actions in Sri Lanka, in Vietnam, in Laos, they want to push back democracy in all of these areas, install similar states and stimulus functions that allow them to press their power and their influence in ways that benefit China and benefit the Chinese Communist Party, but do not benefit either the world and the rules-based order it lives in or the people of those nations. So why exactly should we take the current sanctions that operate on China in recognition that they are an anti-democratic state who has in many ways acted incredibly poorly on the international stage, has thrown about its weight in ways that uses its market power while expecting the West to tie its hands behind the back and not use theirs? Why should this be extended to Hong Kong? I think the first simple reason is that on a principled level, if you are willing to have sanctions against China, you should now have sanctions against Hong Kong. Because over the last few weeks, those last vestiges of its autonomy have been stripped away. They are functionally the same country. But on a practical level, there are two important things to note. Firstly, this is going to be sustainable. If you put sanctions against China, China has limited room to retaliate. Why? Because China is structurally weak against the West, for three reasons. Firstly, let's just look at the domestic politics of the countries that it wishes to target. There's enormous anger around the world about COVID-19. It is an election issue in the United States where both political parties were forced to run anti-China ads. In Australia, in resistance to the aggression from China over the statements made by their government, China has attempted to use its power, but Australia has held firm. There's been a clear bipartisan pushback against China's wish to influence control, which means the democratic will of the Australian people will not be maligned by the Chinese Communist Party. In the UK, Boris Johnson is riding a wave of popularity tied to his ability to stand up for the people of Hong Kong for whom they have an enduring link. The West is not going to back down from this fight, and China cannot escalate more. Why? Because while the CCP is strong, and it's unlikely they'll be losing control anytime soon, they have limited power to inflict pain on the West without inflicting pain on themselves, which means the grand bargain they have with their people weakens when you inflict economic pain on them because of the population bomb that was created by the one-child policy, because of the enormous local government debt, because of the amount of money and power that they pushed into the One Belt and One Road, which because of COVID will not be showing any returns. China just does not have the capacity to enter into an economic fight with the West, which means we are in a unique position to push our influence further. So what exactly does this do to China? Firstly, it makes our current sanctions against China effective, because what China is now doing is laundering its business interests through Hong Kong. It says that Hong Kong is a bastion of free trade, it is a bastion of the rule of law when that no longer exists, which means that it allows them to take the traditional instruments that the West has designated as not fit to exist on the international marketplace and allow them to avoid the sanctions we would put on them. It means that they can use things like their economic might through the Hong Kong market to pressure smaller companies in Vietnam to take on hundreds of Chinese workers and throw Vietnamese people out of jobs. It means they can use their companies in Hong to pressure Djibouti to make sure that they have increased amounts of military bases on their land. If you care about the effectiveness of Chinese sanctions that currently exist, you need to extend those sanctions to Hong Kong. But secondly, and this is most key, it makes goods more expensive, which ties into the analysis I just gave you about why China needs to make sure it has economic growth in order to sustain its bargain with the people in order to maintain its stability, which has two consequences. Firstly, they're likely to back down on actions in Hong Kong. So even if they aren't going to restore the legitimacy of legislative colonies, it means they're not going to attack the courts, because they know that further attacks on the courts will install even greater sanctions upon them, because the rule of law will be declining further. But secondly, it solidifies the rest of the world's expectation that the West will have their back when China decides to use their economic might against them. That is what you need to have opposition politicians in Laos stand up to Chinese influence. We need to make this policy for the people of Hong Kong and the people of the world.
Brilliant, thank you for that. We'll have you first negative speaker.
The trade war between the US and China has currently done exactly nothing to change the behaviour of the CCP and how they are operating. So it is very unclear to us that when they put sanctions onto Hong Kong, whether that is going to change anything at all, given that now Hong Kong only makes up 13% of China's economy as opposed to the 70% it did in the past. What am I going to do in this speech, right? I'm going to push back on what we think the Western interests are and explain to you why it is that this reduces the political capital you have to address things like the Belt and Road and the South China Sea. Then I'm going to talk to you about whether these sanctions will actually be effective and what the incentives of China actually are in this debate, something that they didn't really prove or want to touch. Then I'll explain to you the harm in this debate, which is that you harm the livelihoods of the Hong Kong people who have already been through strife and hardship through all of the protests and don't deserve to have sanctions put upon them. And then I'll deal lastly with that idea about whether sanctions are sustainable or not, right? So in terms of Western interests, we tell you that you have limited political capital internationally, right? The first reason is that sanctions harm both economies, right? So the West incurs a harm by putting sanctions on China because it means that when they're going to trade with other countries in Asia, for example, that are allied with China, you have like a less favourable trading situation with them. But the second thing to say is that there's like a limited amount of pressure you can put on China, right? Because the more you put pressure on China, the more China will push back at you. And at the point where they've basically bought all of the Pacific Island votes in the UN, it means that they can start blocking things that the West really, really wants to push through there. It means that it's going to be politically impossible, or at least politically unfavourable, to put that level of pressure on China. Then the alternative is probably more preferable to just put the pressure on China that's currently existing in order to stop Belt and Road getting out of control, or to stop South China Sea turning into a massive horrible situation, right? So in that case, there is a political trade-off that you have to make in order to put these sanctions on Hong Kong, and it's something that is probably not worth doing considering the geopolitics of what China is doing in the world right now. It probably isn't the most important thing the West should focus on. Daniel says there's a unique relationship with Hong Kong, and the West has a relationship. Sure, we agree with that analysis, but they don't get the outcomes they want by freeing Hong Kong from China's grasp just by putting sanctions, right? They give us this principle, which is if you have sanctions against China, you should have them against Hong Kong. I don't know what sanctions against China they're talking about. I think they're just like doing like debating lies unless they're talking about like the US trade war, which isn't really the same thing. But there was no analysis as to why this principle is true, and also it's completely contingent on the effectiveness of sanctions and the China's incentives in this debate, right? Hong Kong is really important for China, but it is not important for economic reasons. It is important for 3 reasons, right? Firstly, it is important for the one China narrative and a show of force that shows that China is united and China has control over Hong Kong. Secondly, it is to cut down on the liberalism of Hong Kong and to sever the Western connection that Hong Kong has. And thirdly, they don't really want a shining like beacon of democracy next door because it undermines the political structures and power that the CCP has in China and the way that they want to run like their political system, right? So China's incentives in Hong Kong are not about the economy, and that is why when you put economic sanctions on them, they are unlikely to respond in any meaningful way, right? We tell you that China is like extremely powerful. They have a lot of economic production because they have very cheap labor because they have no like labor rights in China, which means that they are able to generate like a lot of money within like the mainland of China itself, right? And they've relied less and less on Hong Kong as they've been moving away from a free trade model and towards an isolationist model and towards an expansionist model where they capture the economies of Asia and Africa, right? Daniel tells us that this means they can't launder businesses through Hong Kong. But the problem is when you put sanctions on Hong Kong, China can still trade with all of Asia and can still trade with all of Africa and all of those sorts of things, right? So this would only work if you put secondary sanctions on all countries that China traded with. At that point, the harms that I'm about to talk to you about the Hong Kong people are just skyrocketing against all of the most disadvantaged countries in the world. That's probably something you shouldn't do, right? Now, in terms of what those harms lead to, we tell you that sanctions are really harmful to people who live in that country, right? It hurts people more than it hurts China. Why is that? Well, firstly, Hong Kong people now just can't get access to the Western goods that make their lives meaningful and make them feel happy and empowered. But we tell you that even more, if they really, really want these sanctions to work, they probably have to accept that they're going to be quite high sanctions, right? They're going to have to be quite a lot, which means that the Hong Kong people are probably looking at situations with very high inflation, not being able to get access to food or necessities. And that's something we think is really harmful to put through. If you care about the Hong Kong people, if you're willing to give them visas to go to the UK, you probably care about them as humans. You probably don't want them to suffer under not being able to get access to money and all of that sort of stuff. We secondly tell you that the less money these people have, the more angry, and leads to doubling down of force for China, right? So what have I proved to you with that point? We think that there's going to be pretty severe harms that go onto people, that they'll have to show they get actual effectiveness out of their model in order to justify those harms that will happen to those people. Lastly, they tell us that these sanctions are sustainable because there's lots of support. Well, that's already clashing against the political cost material I gave you right at the top of my speech, right? But the second thing is that the West is going to lose allies in Asia, right? And it's not just that the West cares about democracy at an abstract level. They care about allies more than they care about democracy, as proved by all of the US coups throughout history, right? So at the end of the debate, it's unclear what these sanctions are. It's unclear how they're going to work, and they're only going to harm the Hong Kong people. We're very proud to stand against this.
Excellent, thank you. We'll have second and first.
I don't do stuff on my phone while I'm live streaming. I have to be on. Every time you cuts on. Yeah, because I've been listening to the chat and I was like, have to live streaming.
I love Bella, and to be honest, it seems like I hate Shar on every level. I actually do love Shar as well. But unfortunately for them, they're losing this debate massively, because their only push at this point so far is the trade war didn't work. But that was with an actor like Donald Trump at the helm, who could not gather to stick together an international coalition of support because he was perceived as irrational, because he fucked off his traditional allies, and that's not where this debate takes place. This is a debate where Joe Biden is president, a historically, internationally popular leader who has forged links across the political community, but also, beyond that relationship, has these angry.
So on their efficacy push, they're already massively on the back foot here. At which point, all we need to demonstrate then is these sanctions are effective and we win the debate. What am I going to do? Two things. First, about the people of Hong Kong and why either you say it in the long run or they don't matter taking the cynical approach, they fall out of this debate. And then secondly, why on efficacy you're going to fuck China up. I've run this point so many times, it's always so much fun because the people of Hong Kong deserve better. First, on the people of Hong Kong. The first claim to note here is that their claim about the people of Hong Kong suffering in the short term is all contingent on them demonstrating that short-term cost is greater in magnitude than the long-term perpetual suffering that happens if China retains control over Hong Kong. A China that will mass extradite people that engage in any form of opposition. A China that will asset strip Hong Kong and take away its wealth and move businesses away from that land as they accumulate more power over it. A China that will forcefully indoctrinate the people of Hong Kong because they feel as though they've internalized British ideals of liberty and will use every repressive means possible. So when you say there is a short-term harm, that needs to be weighed against the long-term harm in the future as long as China exists where they're constantly getting fucked over. But even if you do not buy that analysis, on the most cynical approach, this is about what the West should do. And you know what? Maybe the West doesn't care individually about those people, but they sure as fuck care about Hong Kong as an economic asset, as a symbol, and as a trying to get a win over the Chinese. They want to project power to the rest of Asia and to the rest of the world that they are winning this fight, that the West is dominant, that China can not get away with breaching rules, that China cannot be left alone as it is. And the only way to do this is to change the Hong Kong situation, to make it unviable, and to force them to pull out. Which brings me on to where this debate actually comes down to. Efficacy. Do these sanctions actually work? The first claim we get from side affirm negative is to say, this undermines your interest at the UN. The West has broadly given up on the UN because for one very simple structural reason, which is that if you look to the UN Human Rights Council that is currently stacked with states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, it's the case that vote buying clearly doesn't work. The UN is not a body that does anything. The UN didn't authorize the Iraq war, right? The West is perfectly happy to go ahead. They don't care about the UN. It's a rubber stamp body that does nothing at this point beyond funnel money and development aid and doesn't truly affect their interests. The next thing we get is the trade war does nothing. My introduction responds to that, which is that that's broadly not comparative, but also importantly as a second level of response, the important point to note here is that China is incredibly economically dependent on like the West more broadly. And why is that? The first point to note here is that, here we go. Okay, firstly, China, as it is, operates as an actor at the moment, is actually just getting fucked in terms of their comparative advantage, right? So if you would notice, 10 years ago you were all wearing shirts made in China. Now you are all likely wearing shirts made in Bangladesh. And that is because the cost of labour prices in emerging economies like Bangladesh mean that China no longer has the capacity to meaningfully compete against them, which means you talk about trade with Africa and trade with the rest of Asia, that's already not happening in terms of the raw manufacturing of goods. The second level then to say is they also can't expand the software at the moment. They are already hindered by US sanctions that are imposed by both the WTO and other Western actors because they continue to pirate software. That is the only mechanism for them to expand at the moment. At the point that you escalate those sanctions on Hong Kong, a way for them to funnel their software out through that country, importantly, there's no way they can get a comparative advantage there, but also restricts their economy more broadly. But thirdly, China, by funding its expansionary project broadly, has local government debt that it holds, which is massively, which puts them in a particularly precarious situation at the point they start seeing any kind of global default. All that says then, very simply, is that China is not as strong as everyone thinks. You should all sleep a little bit easier. I'm telling that to Embrace particularly, who I know is really scared of China, as I learned last year. Don't worry, you're going to be fine. China is pretty fucked in this case in terms of economically. A bit more sanctions means you probably get some leverage room here. The only thing we get in response here is you've got limited political capital here, and Asia is going to have to push back and they'll trade with the rest of the world. The first point to note here is that Asia is incredibly interlinked now with Western actors such as Australia and New Zealand in terms of their trading industries. Look to the TPPA redux, where effectively there is an increase in trade exports, both in terms of agriculture from New Zealand, which is massively consumed in Asia, but also things like Australian resources like minerals, rare earth minerals, all those things that are shipped in, but importantly all the service industries that Australia and New Zealand provide to those countries and Western countries, which China can't comparatively provide, because Chinese consulting is really shit, right? It's like, what's the law in this case? You don't need law. Literally Chinese consulting is just not comparatively advantageous compared to a complex system of years of decades through Deloitte, PwC, they've built that up, and incredibly important for the development of Asian countries, so they're likely to follow the West in that instance. The last thing we get is that China doesn't care at the end of the day because they care about one Hong Kong West and Western liberations, and maybe they don't care about all the economic stuff. The problem here is they do care about all the economic stuff, right? Because the only way they're able to maintain that narrative and build that is on the contingent situation that China is the best, that they do retain the grand bargain. And the point that sanctions cripple the trade links of money flowing into Hong Kong and then eventually China, and the point there is an ongoing political cost, and the point Carrie Lam is coming on TV saying how Magnitsky sanctions have fucked her up, that's the point when things start to get dicey for China. That's the point where their comparative advantage that was very bad starts to fucking war, the sanctions start working, and China has to back down, and Grace gets to sleep easy at night.
Excellent. Much welcome to the negatives.
So I too love Daniel and Zach, and I've debated with them, girls, each of them individually. And the one thing I know about them is that they fucking lie all the time. Zach's pre-prepared why China is failing arguments. I've heard him run the exact opposite several times as well. Sorry, Grace, I'm going to talk about why China is not fucked and why you are absolutely right to be worried about them. But more than that, why those sanctions that they wanted to talk about and the lazy weighing by Zach is not enough for them to win this debate. Because they need to show not only that sanctions work in Hong Kong, but also the impact that the sanctions that they put on China, or on Hong Kong in general, are going to come at a cost of making other changes in China. Note firstly, my split basically. I'm going to talk about short-term costs in Hong Kong and people weighing that up. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the actual outcomes that Zach and Daniel actually have to prove. And the lazy start of Daniel's speech about, we're not going to get a lot of change, we're just going to stop certain amounts of influence and talk about the actual change that could ever achieve even in their best case scenario, then talk about why sanctions aren't going to work, but you're actually going to harm relations between China and the West in general, but also from Asia more broadly. Let's talk about the people of Hong Kong. The first point to note is that what Zach wanted us to do lazily was saying, the short-term cost maybe is not greater than the long-term outcome there. The first point to note is Daniel's outcome, as I already mentioned, isn't actually going to change anything in Hong Kong, right? They were like, you can maybe pressure China to not do as much anymore and stop influencing courts. Note, the security law has already been passed and China is never going to remove that because it makes them look weak to their own people and weak to Asia to bow down to Western influence. That alone should lose them this debate because they have no control at all. The Legislative Council is controlled by pro-China individuals. Those sanctions aren't going to change anything for the people of Hong Kong. The sanctions are in fact going to do much more harm in the short term and in the long term because they obviously want sustainable sanctions over the long term, right? And so Zach then in his speech and then he's weighing there, accepts the need to prove a large change, and now compare that to Daniel's speech in your notes and explain and try and think about what kind of change did they actually achieve there. Let's now talk about the sanctions. Now before that, let me talk about the outcomes in general to China from sanctions. The first point to note is that sanctions aren't present in the status quo. They aren't effective. Sanctions on Hong Kong by themselves isn't going to work, as all of Bella's analysis still remains unresponded to the point at which you actually want to pressure China in a massive amount. You then need to have secondary sanctions all throughout Asia and isolate all of China's allies. So obviously having Biden, that Grumpy himself has described as Swiss cheese brain Biden, is not going to actually change the efficacy of sanctions just by having a leader that's different from Trump in control. Actually, we think Biden is likely to ride a wave of anti-China propaganda, but then even out after a while. And this is the problem, because the trade-off of their sustainability comes from political pushes by anti-China sentiment in a lot of Western countries. That means two things. The first is that there are much easier ways than sanctions to do this. Because it's not about the political sustainability, but the economic sustainability when you sanction China and then they sanction you back and they retaliate trade wars and sanctions against you. Because then all the goods that you want from China, all the microchips and the rare earth minerals that they provide to you because they control like 70% of it, that stuff becomes more expensive, and that's a cost on the people themselves. So we're unlikely to see that continue in the long term. That sustainability doesn't work. But also, this is the political capital cost that Bella talked to you about, right? Because if you just can say, as Australia, we're putting sanctions on Hong Kong, and nothing really changes there, as I will deal with bit later, that removes any political push to do other things, like pressure China in the South China Sea, or also do things like stop them from fucking countries over in Asia by giving them bad loans. Let's now talk about the sanctions, whether they're effective. First, note, let's go through all of Grumpy's analysis one by one. The first thing he says is that they're fucked and they don't have comparative advantage anymore. No, China doesn't care about manufacturing anymore. They're no longer importing. They're no longer exporting. What they want to do is import to sustain the demand of their middle class. And that's why Bangladesh and other countries in Asia have been put under the thumb of China, because they're trying to divert trade to them. And that's going to happen more, and they're going to become a central hub for that kind of creation. That means they're going into other things like software. Let's talk about Grumpy's lies here. First thing he says, oh, they can't really do anything with technology. They don't have any ability to make software. Look at Alipay, look at TikTok. There are literal technology giants in China that the rest of Asia use for everything. Literally everyone, even in New Zealand, uses Alipay to buy things online. And that is the only thing that is centralized and controlled by China, and those companies are beholden to China. That is something that most individuals can't go without, and sanctions aren't going to stop people from using them as much. That's why they're going to go under the Chinese umbrella. But also that control over rare earth minerals, and in Taiwan being able to generate the microchips in TSIM means that they have significant control compared to the West in being able to be independent in technology and compete against India, which they're doing in the status quo, and they did during Trump's trade war. It's unclear as to why this changes at all under their side. The last point about debt is also not true, because we think that the debt, for example, in China is very different from the debt in the West. The trade deficits there are favor China, but also it doesn't matter, because the state control of companies means that you're able to structure debt within companies in a way that free market economies can't. So China can always withstand trade wars and sanctions way better than the West can. This means that there is no change. Having Biden in there was not analyzed at all. At the end of this point, it's clear then that China is able to withstand a lot of those sanctions and not actually change. But even to the point that they deter some change in Hong Kong, that harm has already occurred. Hong Kong is now part of China in all but name, which means there is no way for them to get any outcomes, but they harm the people of Hong Kong. They don't get any change in terms of sanctions, but they remove any sort of political capital to do anything else against China, and then they therefore lose this debate.
Thank you for that reply.
It would look extremely weak for China to bow in political terms to economic sanctions that weren't even putting a dent in their economy. Ask yourself, panel, why would China do that? Why would they just make any sort of symbolic concessions to the West, even the smallest one, to help westernize Hong Kong, when it's their entire incentive to have as much control over Hong Kong as possible, both for their own interests, but for the political picture they're trying to paint across the world. What am I going to do in this reply? I'm firstly going to deal with the massive harm to the people of Hong Kong they wanted to wave away and say it would all be better in the future. Then I'll deal with why sanctions are not effective, focusing on that Asia trading material they just didn't want to touch in this debate. And lastly, I'll tell you why you trade off political capital to make further changes to China. So firstly, on the people of Hong Kong, Zach literally accepts the harms that I told you would happen, right? He's just like, oh, but in the long term they'll be better, which is entirely contingent on them proving their sanctions material are effective, which they didn't. Then they tell us the West doesn't care about Hong Kong people, it just cares about Hong Kong as a concept. Well, that's unclear to me why Australia and the UK would offer visas to help people escape Hong Kong if they didn't care about Hong Kong as people. And that's something I told you in my first speech. They clearly care about the human rights implication of Hong Kong, and so they care about Hong Kong's people rather than just Hong Kong as a political beacon. We tell you it is awful to force these people to go through the trauma and the police violence they only so recently faced just for a chance that is unlikely to be effective, that China might make a small concession to these people. They're probably behind at this point. I hope that we win the final for them. Okay, in terms of China, Shah told you that it would look extremely weak to bow to sanctions, what I just said in my introduction, right? Even the smallest of concessions is symbolically huge for China, so there's a massive disincentive to even make marginal change. Then in terms of efficacy of sanctions, like we told you that like the Asia and Africa material, in fact they are trading with them, like still stands, it was never addressed by them in this debate. I told you that China was moving away from free trade and engaging with the West, moving to an isolationist and neo-colonialist expansion over Asia and Africa, creating that hub. China isn't trading like majoritarily with the West, and to the extent they're engaging in tech trade, it's probably going to harm the West more than it's going to harm China, because China can just trade tech to all of the developing economies over those areas I just talked about, right? So at the end of this debate, right, they either have to like sanction all of Asia, or they have to like trade off all of the political influence they have over Asia, because like China is just like, you have to completely pay back your Belt and Road loans that I have over your ports if you engage with the West, right? They have so much leverage over Asia, it's unclear how the West is ever going to be able to undermine the trading relationships they have there by just putting sanctions between trade between the West and China, right? Then in terms of political capital, they're like, oh, the West has given up on the UN, they don't care. Like, I still think that like, the material still stands here. Like, it's still important for the UN to like be functioning in some sense and not just completely taken over by China, if not just for the signaling effect that they want to say. But secondly, Asia still exists, right? You lose allies in China and Africa, like you lose allies in Asia and China to Africa, and that's really bad. They never proved why it was worth putting sanctions specifically on Hong Kong and making these people go through the trauma that they just faced in order to do absolutely nothing. We're very proud to win this debate.
I'm going to start this reply by discussing a tension and a misunderstanding. The tension is that they claim that Hong Kong is now indistinguishable from China, and we quite clearly stood for extending the same sanctions that currently exist on China to the rest of Hong Kong. And they couldn't explain why it was appropriate once and not appropriate in another instance to push back against a China that they claimed throughout their speeches was incredibly dangerous. So it's unclear why they wanted to give China increasing capital to carry out that agenda. And the misunderstanding is how they treat opportunity cost and political capital in Asia. Because political capital is not something you spend, it's something that you nurture. And if you signal to all Asian nations that you will not have their back if China increasingly strips away their control and power, and you will be willing to fund their imperialism and aggression through the Hong Kong companies you're using to escape the types of agendas that you're setting, you do not generate political capital, you tell them that their only alternative is China. The one clash in this debate is how do we change Chinese behavior? What do we tell you? Obviously, China doesn't want to do this action. That is clear. That was never something that we were going to push back on our side of the house. But it is also true that China has deep disincentives to avoid economic pain. Why? Firstly, because they have economic interests themselves, and secondly, because we told you there was a grand bargain they had with their people that is increasingly difficult to carry out as their growth stagnates. What does our policy do? Firstly, it means that Chinese sanctions that are currently in place work. It means they can't avoid those sanctions by transferring Alipay to a Hong Kong-based listing and then avoiding all the sanctions that we currently use to control the influence of that company worldwide. But secondly, it just increases their economic pain, which gives them a clear economic incentive not to do it. We never claimed it was about public reaction or huge uprisings in Hong Kong. It was A, about the pain we inflict on China, especially Chinese elites, and secondly, about removing the reasons that they have to strip away Hong Kong democracy, which is to use it as a trading post to avoid Western sanctions. How do you compare that at the harms? And I firstly want to note the extraordinarily ungenerous interpretation from side negating in this debate about the types of sanctions. They would have you believe we're like taking medicine away from the people of Hong Kong. That's quite clearly not what we're doing. We're extending the current sanctions we have on China, hitting Chinese leaders, hitting Chinese major companies, stopping their ability to express influence across the world. And secondly, it's contingent all their material and harm increasing on us not being able to be successful with these sanctions, and therefore, of course, the debate falls apart for us anyway. So it may increase their margin, but it's never material that could win them the debate. So what is the result we get on our side of the house? Firstly, you link the results of your increased attacks on China to increased sanctions, decreasing the chance to strip away stuff like autonomy of the court, supports, which is what I presented to you at first. Secondly, you decrease the incentive that China has to increasingly strip away Chinese democracy, because now they know they cannot use it as a way to launder their business interests. And finally, it allows you to shore up your political support worldwide, because as we told you at myself and Zach, China trades on the ability that it is strong. China lies to the world and says, we are your only alternative. The West will not have your back if you stand up against us. So what do we do? Firstly, we reduce the power of Chinese businesses by reducing their access to Western consumers. We make those companies weaker, less able to spread. And then secondly, we make it signal the weakness of China and make it clear to the people of the world that they will have an ally if their time comes.